What happens when the voice of Nazi terror is silenced, not by justice, but by fate? Roland Freisler, Hitler's most feared judge, spent years condemning thousands with his furious words. Yet in his final 24 hours, the man who embodied the Reich's cruelty met an end no one could script. From sirens to a crushing blow, his downfall shows power undone in an instant. Stay with us for Freisler's shocking last day. By early 1945, Berlin had already begun to suffocate under the weight of destruction. Allied bombs reduced neighborhoods to rubble, smoke veiled the sky, and the ordinary citizen lived in a constant state of hunger and fear. Yet within this chaos, one man continued his work with merciless devotion, Roland Freisler, the president of the People's Court. To him, war in the streets was background noise. Inside his courtroom, the true war was not against advancing armies, but against his fellow Germans who dared to dissent. Freisler's courtroom had long ceased to resemble a place of justice. It was a stage, an arena designed to humiliate, terrorize, and destroy the human spirit. Unlike traditional judges who sought order, he thrived in disorder, turning every proceeding into a storm of insults, shouts, and mockery. Observers who managed to sit through his trials often described them as unbearable spectacles, more like executions than judicial hearings. Defendants were stripped not only of legal defense, but also of human dignity, dressed in oversized clothes without belts, forced to hold up their trousers before the bench while Freisler hurled venom at them. By this time, his name was synonymous with death. Between 1942 and 1945, he had overseen more than 5,000 death sentences. Almost 90% of the cases he presided over ended with execution. He had no interest in weighing evidence. The verdict was predetermined, his role merely to deliver it with the flair of a man who believed himself to be the very voice of Hitler's will. He boasted of judging as the Führer himself would judge, transforming his bench into a pulpit of fanatic loyalty. This reputation meant that even as Germany teetered on collapse, his influence remained terrifying. Many in Berlin whispered that to be summoned before Freisler was worse than facing a firing squad. His crimson judicial robe became an image burned into memory, the blood-red fabric framed against the cold walls of the People's Court, an omen of inevitable death. With fists slamming against his desk and veins bulging in his neck, he seemed less like a judge and more like a predator circling his prey. It was not only his manner that struck fear, but the propaganda value attached to his trials. Cameras recorded his outbursts, preserving his rages for the Nazi-controlled newsreels that spread across Germany. These films were meant to display the regime's unshakable justice, but in reality, they revealed something darker, the raw performance of cruelty, staged for an audience already drowning in war. The People's Court under Freisler was not law, but theater, and he, its most dangerous actor. As Berlin collapsed into ruins, one might have expected Freisler to falter. Yet he thrived on the crumbling environment, using it as further justification to intensify his attacks on supposed traitors. To him, resistance within was more unforgivable than bombs from above. Each guilty verdict reaffirmed his devotion. Each shout across the chamber reassured him of his relevance. He was, in every sense, a judge at the height of terror, wielding authority as though destruction itself made him stronger. But what happens when the walls of his courtroom, the very stage on which he commanded fear, begin to tremble with a power greater than his own voice? Stay with us to uncover the details. The weight of enemies. The winter of 1945 pressed down on Berlin like an iron shroud. Streets were littered with broken glass and fallen bricks, but inside Roland Freisler's chambers, there was no time for reflection. His desk overflowed with case files, each folder representing a man or woman accused of betraying the Reich. These papers were not simple bureaucratic records. They were death warrants waiting for his signature. To Freisler, they were trophies, evidence of his power to silence voices that dared to speak against Hitler. Unlike other judges who sought to reduce their workload as the war turned disastrous, Freisler demanded more. He thrived on trials of traitors, especially those accused of ties to resistance networks or failed plots against Hitler. On February 3rd, hours before his own fate was sealed, he reviewed the files of high-ranking military officers who had once dared to defy the Führer. Each page contained testimony, interrogation notes, and accusations designed to condemn. These documents carried the lives of men who had worn the same uniforms as the soldiers still dying on the Eastern Front. Freisler showed no mercy for them. What made him so relentless was not just loyalty to the Nazi cause, but personal ambition. He long believed himself to be the intellectual face of Hitler's justice system, a man whose sharp legal mind had been twisted into an instrument of fear. If the Reich survived, Freisler envisioned his name engraved in its history as the jurist who defended it against internal collapse. This vision kept him working feverishly, ignoring the bombs and shortages outside, convinced that prosecuting enemies within was his highest duty. The men and women who passed through his court in those last weeks were not always hardened conspirators. Some were ordinary citizens who had whispered a word of doubt about the war, others caught listening to foreign radio broadcasts. Yet to Freisler, every whisper was treason, every doubt a betrayal worthy of death. He treated no one differently. Generals, students, and housewives were dragged before him with the same contempt, their defenses interrupted by his sharp insults, their attempts to speak drowned by his furious voice. On his desk that morning lay the file of a prominent officer accused of participating in the failed July 20th plot against Hitler. The handwriting of interrogators recorded confessions torn from men under torture, but to Freisler, the brutality of their extraction was irrelevant. He did not seek truth, he sought punishment, and he would deliver it with the same theatrical rage that had made him infamous. Those who observed him closely noticed that he worked with manic precision. Pages turned rapidly under his fingers, his eyes scanning lines with mechanical speed. Occasionally, he underlined passages in thick strokes of pencil, marking the points he would use to humiliate defendants in open court. Witnesses later recalled how he sometimes muttered to himself while reading, practicing the very insults he would hurl hours later. It was preparation not for justice, but for performance. The defendants never stood a chance. They entered the chamber already condemned, their fate sealed by the man in crimson who viewed every trial as an extension of Hitler's will. Yet what Freisler did not grasp was that his own name was already written on another list, one not drafted by the Gestapo, but by the inexorable hand of war itself. As he sharpened his words and prepared for another day of prosecutions, he could not hear the gathering thunder in the skies above Berlin. His enemies were not just in the files on his desk. They were coming on wings of steel, carrying with them the destruction he could not sentence away. What force would break through the walls of his courtroom and silence the judge forever? Stay with us to know what really happened. Sirens over Berlin. The morning of February 3rd, 1945, began with a chilling sound that Berliners had come to dread, the rising wail of the air raid siren. It cut through the frozen air like a knife, echoing across the broken city where buildings leaned half-destroyed and fires smoldered from previous raids. For most, the sound was an order to flee to basements or bunkers, to clutch children tightly and wait for the storm to pass. But inside the halls of the People's Court, Roland Freisler dismissed the warning as background noise, as though the heavens themselves could not intrude upon his dominion. The sirens meant more than just danger. They signaled the reach of Allied power deep into the heart of the Third Reich. American B-17 flying fortresses and British Lancasters were no longer limited to striking the periphery. By 1945, Berlin itself had become a regular target, and February 3rd brought one of the most devastating raids yet. Nearly 1,000 aircraft were dispatched that day, their payloads designed not only to cripple infrastructure but to crush morale. The thunder of engines filled the sky, and their shadows darkened the city below. For ordinary citizens, these raids were apocalyptic. Whole districts vanished under walls of fire, rail yards erupted, and hospitals collapsed with the wounded still inside. Civilians scrambled for shelter, knowing that a single direct hit could erase entire families. Even hardened soldiers stationed in the city admitted to feeling powerless as the bombs fell. Yet in the grand courtroom where Freisler sat, the proceedings pressed on as if human will could hold back the steel rain. What makes this moment remarkable is not only Freisler's refusal to acknowledge the danger, but the scale of destruction occurring just beyond his walls. On that single day, more than 20,000 people would lose their lives in Berlin. The air became a mixture of dust, smoke, and the acrid sting of burning chemicals. The ground shook with each detonation, yet Freisler, clutching his trial files, demanded order from his defendants as though chaos itself bowed to him. Those inside the building later recalled the eerie dissonance. The booming of bombs outside matched against the booming of Freisler's voice inside. It was as though two storms collided, one human, one mechanical. Witnesses noted how he seemed determined to finish his session, regardless of the crumbling world beyond the courtroom walls. In that defiance lay the essence of his fanaticism. Even as destruction surrounded him, he clung to his role as judge, refusing to recognize that a greater judgment was about to fall upon him. The sirens, however, were not cries he could ignore forever. With each passing minute, the raid drew closer to the very heart of Berlin, and the People's Court, once untouchable, was squarely in the path of destruction. The Allied bombers did not discriminate between government offices and civilian homes. To them, every building was a piece of the enemy's machinery. Freisler's court, symbolic of tyranny masquerading as law, was about to meet the same fate as so many factories and rail lines. In the sky above, pilots released their bombs with chilling precision. They fell like iron rain, whistling through the air before detonating with a force that shattered stone and steel alike. The People's Court, with its columns and ornate architecture, had survived earlier raids, but February 3rd would test its endurance to the breaking point. The walls that had once contained Freisler's fury were about to be tested by a fury greater than his own. The sirens that morning were not just warnings for Berliners, they were heralds of fate. And while many would escape to bunkers and live another day, Roland Freisler remained chained to his bench, unaware that the roar above was not background noise but the sound of destiny descending. How long could the courtroom stand before the skies themselves shattered its silence? Come with us to find out more. The trial interrupted. On that fateful day, the People's Court was not just a courtroom, it was a stage brimming with tension. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of the accused, guards stood rigid with rifles at their sides, and stenographers prepared to capture every venomous word hurled from the bench. The atmosphere was suffocating, not because of the winter air, but because everyone inside knew they were trapped in a theater of death where the ending had already been written. Roland Freisler sat at the center, his crimson robe draped across the seat like a bloodstain on the institution itself. Before him stood the defendants, men accused of betraying the Reich in a time when betrayal was defined not by actions, but by thoughts. Their faces betrayed exhaustion from interrogations, but there was no hope of reprieve. All they could expect was humiliation at the hands of a man who had perfected the art of dismantling dignity. Freisler began his session with his trademark aggression. He fired questions that were not questions at all, but accusations dressed in rhetoric. He cut off answers before they could form, using his voice as both gavel and verdict. The prosecutors sat with folded hands, unnecessary in a room where the judge himself acted as interrogator, jury, and executioner. To many, it was less a legal proceeding and more an orchestration of rage. The accused struggled to maintain composure. Some tried to explain their actions, hoping against futility that words might change the outcome. Others stood silently, refusing to feed Freisler's performance with responses. Silence, however, only enraged him more. His voice rose until it shook the chandeliers, each insult echoing like a whip crack across the chamber. This was his way of asserting dominance. Drown out reason, leave no space for defense, and reduce his opponents to trembling figures before the state. Yet while his fury filled the courtroom, another kind of thunder was rising outside. The bombing raid that had begun in the distance drew steadily closer. Windows rattled, dust drifted from the ceiling, and faint vibrations crept through the stone floor. The guards shifted uneasily, glancing toward the doors as if escape might soon be necessary. Freisler, however, ignored these signs. He barked at the defendants as if his shouts could drown out the bombs. Then came the moment that cracked the illusion of control. A blast resounded close enough to send tremors through the hall. A chandelier swayed violently, scattering shards of light across the room. Papers fluttered from the judge's desk, and for the first time, the audience in the gallery gasped audibly. The trial, which until then had followed Freisler's orchestrated rhythm, faltered. The defendants, still chained to their fates, looked upward as if the heavens themselves were intervening. Still, Freisler pressed on. He slammed his fists onto the bench, shouting for order. His voice, usually the loudest in the chamber, now competed with explosions that rolled through the city like distant drums of war. He clutched his files with white-knuckled determination, unwilling to let go of the authority he believed unshakable. To him, pausing the trial would be an admission that his will was not absolute, that even he could be silenced by forces greater than his own. Witnesses later recounted the surreal juxtaposition, defendants awaiting their death sentences, a judge screaming over the sound of falling bombs, and spectators unsure whether to stay seated or flee for their lives. The People's Court, normally a chamber of calculated fear, had become something different that day, a room caught between man's performance of power and nature's interruption of it. For years, Freisler had controlled the script. But now, in the very middle of his performance, something unscripted had entered. The trial had been interrupted not by appeals, not by defense lawyers, but by the shattering reminder that the war outside would not wait for his theatrics to end. Would his furious insistence on control hold against the destruction that pressed against the walls of his court? Stay here to know. The crushing blow. The People's Court was built to project permanence. Its stone pillars, high ceilings, and heavy doors were meant to convey the authority of a regime that claimed it would last 1,000 years. But even the most imposing structures can be reduced to rubble in seconds, and on February 3, 1945, that illusion of strength collapsed in dramatic fashion. The bombing run that morning did not spare symbols of the Nazi state. Allied aircraft had released their deadly cargo in waves, each explosion closer than the last. Inside the courtroom, the tension mounted as plaster dust trickled from the ceiling. The ground beneath the benches shook, rattling chains and scattering papers across the floor. What had been a theater of intimidation moments earlier was rapidly becoming a chamber of dread. Then it happened. A deafening roar tore through the hall as a masonry column gave way. Stone cracked, iron supports bent, and in the chaos, fragments rained down on judge, defendants, and guards alike. Amid the confusion, Roland Freisler was struck. Accounts differ on the precise moment, but what is certain is that the collapse silenced him instantly. The man whose voice had dominated every trial was gone in a single, crushing blow. Witnesses later claimed that he was found pinned under debris, his crimson robe torn and his body twisted unnaturally. In a grim irony, clutched tightly in his hands was a defendant's file, as if he had refused to relinquish the instrument of his authority, even in death. The same documents he had used to condemn others became his final possession. The impact stunned the entire room. Guards who had once followed his every command now scrambled in confusion, torn between aiding the injured and seeking shelter from further collapse. Defendants, moments away from their expected death sentences, stood frozen as the scene unfolded. For some, it was not survival they felt, but disbelief that the man who had wielded such unchecked power could be reduced to nothing by falling stone. What makes the moment more striking is how sudden it was. For years, Freisler had controlled the tempo of his trials, orchestrating every second with precision. Yet in that instant, the tempo belonged to forces beyond his reach. No sentence could be shouted, no verdict handed down, no insult thrown across the chamber. His reign ended not with a final decree, but with silence beneath rubble. Outside the court, the city burned. Firefighters and civilians rushed to extinguish blazes, to dig out survivors from collapsed homes, to retrieve bodies from the streets. Amid this broader catastrophe, the death of a judge might have seemed insignificant. Yet within the Nazi system, his loss was a rupture. The man who had presided over thousands of executions, who had been the theatrical face of Hitler's justice, was gone. His absence created a void in the machinery of terror, even if only for a brief moment. Those who saw his body carried from the ruins could not help but feel the weight of irony. Freisler had lived by condemning others, by elevating himself as the hand of the Führer. Yet no Führer could save him from the collapse of stone and steel. His fate was not chosen in a courtroom, but delivered from the skies above Berlin. The crushing blow that ended his life was more than physical. It shattered the illusion that his authority was untouchable. For the first time, the voice that had silenced thousands was itself silenced forever. But what happened in the eerie quiet that followed when the dust settled and the survivors looked upon the wreckage of the courtroom? Let us tell you. The silence after the shout. When the dust finally began to settle, the People's Court no longer resembled a chamber of order. Broken beams hung from the ceiling, shards of glass carpeted the floor, and the once proud pillars now stood fractured. What had been a theatre of power only minutes before was transformed into a ruin of smoke and silence. The most striking change was not the physical destruction, but the absence of sound. For years, Roland Freisler's voice had dominated every inch of that courtroom, his shrieks and interruptions drowning out any attempt at defense. Now there was nothing, only the muffled cries of those trapped under rubble, the scrape of boots on stone, and the distant thunder of bombs still falling across Berlin. The furious conductor of this grim orchestra had been silenced forever. Those who survived the collapse described a surreal stillness. Defendants, who moments earlier had braced themselves for death sentences, now stood among the debris, unsure whether to feel relief or terror. Some guards, stripped of the commanding voice they had obeyed without hesitation, hesitated like men suddenly cut adrift. Even the stenographers, whose pens had long been tools of condemnation, sat frozen in disbelief. For the first time, the oppressive rhythm of Freisler's courtroom had been broken. The silence carried an eerie symbolism. A man who had once claimed to judge as Hitler himself would judge had been robbed of his stage and his script. No sentence could be issued, no verdict proclaimed. In that void, the survivors glimpsed a fleeting taste of what life without him might mean. Yet even this brief reprieve was overshadowed by the wider chaos beyond the walls, where the city itself lay in ruins and the war pressed on with merciless force. Berlin's skies still echoed with explosions, but inside the People's Court, the absence of Freisler's roar was louder than any bomb. The silence marked the sudden and irreversible end of a reign of terror, though those present did not yet fully grasp the devastating weight of what had occurred that day. If the trial had been his stage, the collapse was his final curtain. And in that abrupt quiet, one question lingered. What judgment awaited the judge himself in the hours to come? God's verdict. The body of Roland Freisler was not carried from the ruins with ceremony. There were no flags, no honors, no speeches. Instead, his remains were taken quietly through the broken streets of Berlin to the Lützow hospital, a place already overwhelmed with casualties from the bombing raid. Amid the wounded soldiers and civilians who fought for their lives, the corpse of the Reich's most feared judge arrived like another casualty of war, stripped of the authority that once defined him. Witnesses at the hospital recalled the moment with a mixture of disbelief and grim satisfaction. Nurses and attendants who had endured years under his reign of terror did not mourn. One worker, upon seeing his broken body, muttered words that carried more weight than any official decree. It is God's verdict. In that simple statement, the death of a man who had sentenced thousands was framed as divine justice, a final reckoning beyond human law. No announcement of his death rang out across Berlin. The Nazi regime, desperate to preserve its illusion of strength, chose silence. His body was placed in his wife's family grave in Berlin, an unmarked burial that spoke louder than any epitaph. His name was omitted from the stone, erased as if to deny him even the dignity of remembrance. For a man who had built his life on spectacle, his end was cloaked in anonymity, hidden from public view and swiftly forgotten. What lingers is the irony. Freisler had believed himself untouchable, the embodiment of Hitler's will in the courtroom, the arbiter of life and death for so many. Yet he was destroyed not by an assassin's bullet, not by resistance fighters, but by the collapse of stone and fire from the skies. His life ended with no trial, no defense, no plea, only rubble as the final gavel striking down upon him. The People's Court, where thousands had been condemned, was left in ruins. Its legacy, like that of its president, became a symbol of terror turned to dust. The silence of his grave, unmarked and forgotten, stands in stark contrast to the thunder of his voice that once shook the walls of Berlin. His fate serves as a haunting reminder that even the most fearsome architects of cruelty cannot escape the judgment of history, nor the quiet erasure that follows their fall. What do you think about Roland Freisler's shocking final day? Was his death an accident of war, or a chilling twist of fate that delivered its own verdict? Share your thoughts in the comments below.